Welcome back, Trailblazers. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a moment to talk about a tool that has completely transformed the way I plan and navigate my hikes, AllTrails Plus. As a Trailheads ambassador and the organizer of the Yakima Valley Trekkers, I'm out on the trails a lot. One of my favorite features of AllTrails Plus is the ability to edit and create my own maps. Conditions change, fallen trees, washed out sections, or even a last-minute reroute. And with AllTrails Plus, I can adjust my route on the fly and share it with others so everyone stays informed and safe. AllTrails Plus also gives you offline maps, wrong turn alerts, and 3D trail previews to help you stay on track and make the most of your adventure. And the best part, you can get 30% off an AllTrails Plus membership with my exclusive link in the episode show notes. So whether you're planning your next big trek or just looking for a new trail to explore, AllTrails Plus has you covered. Check it out and let's hit the trail. Welcome to Season 14 of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. I'm your host, Ivan, and each week we're hitting the trails through conversations with extraordinary hikers from across the United States and beyond. Spring has a way of pulling us back out there. Muddy boots, wildflowers pushing through the thaw, and trails that feel brand new, even when we've walked them 100 times before. There's something electric about this season, when the days stretch longer, the snowpack starts its slow retreat, and the mountains finally say, "Come on up." This season, I've had the privilege of sitting down with hikers whose stories carry the same sense of renewal, of fresh starts, new summits, and the kind of momentum that only comes when you've been waiting all winter to lace up and go. From early season ridge walks and creek crossings swollen with snowmelt to the quiet joy of watching the landscape wake up mile by mile, the voices you'll hear this season remind us that the trail is always calling. You just have to answer. So shake off the cabin fever, air out the pack, and get ready. Season 14 is here, and the conversations ahead are as alive, layered, and full of possibility as a Pacific Northwest spring. What happens when a 33-year McKinsey career ends on Friday and you're on an ice wall by Saturday afternoon? Tom French, author of The Gap Years, Climbing, Skiing, and the Journey Back, joins us to talk about trading his corporate corner office for crampons, summiting Everest under a full moon at 2:15 a.m., and why it's never too late to reclaim the passions of your younger years. Tom's story begins with a childhood shaped by legendary mountaineer Willi Unsoeld, the first man to climb Everest's West Ridge, who literally taught Tom to climb at age 8. Decades later, after raising a family and building an elite business career, Tom didn't quietly retire. He launched a gap year that stretched into 3.5 extraordinary years of ice climbing, cross-country ski marathons, and 2 Everest expeditions. We dig into his gripping turnaround at 26,000 feet on his first summit attempt, the remote Makalu Barun approach he took on his second, and what the emotional release at base camp, not the summit, truly taught him about achievement. Without further ado, let's jump into this episode with our guest, Tom French. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. I have a really exciting guest with me today. His name is Tom, and he's going to be sharing about his experiences with the outdoors as well as his new book that's just released. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We always like to start off by having our guests share a little bit about themselves and how they got started hiking.
Well, thanks, Ivan. Great to be with you. And I love talking about how I got started hiking. In my case, my father owned a backpacking and hiking and camping equipment shop in my hometown outside of Boston, Andover, Massachusetts. His version of babysitting was letting the kids crawl all over and around the floor of the camping equipment store when we were really little. And I hung out, and the people who worked in that shop were all avid hikers and climbers, as was my father. So I a little bit had no choice. I got dragged into it by my parents, but I also was completely fascinated by it, just given the environment of everybody who was in that store. So I started hiking about at the time I could walk, and it kind of went from there. As I write about in the book, ended up getting taught how to climb by an individual who was a very famous mountaineer. In fact, spent a good amount of time out in the Pacific Northwest where you are, Willi Unsoeld. So I idolized him, and he's the guy who kind of took me from hiking to climbing, but that's another story.
I'd love to kind of dive into your book, The Gap Years, that you just released, and the thing that really captured my attention is it opens with you walking out of your McKinsey office in Boston on a Friday, and then by Saturday afternoon, you're on an ice wall in the Crawford Notch. Most people take time to decompress after a 33-year plus career. What was it about having a physical objective immediately that you knew that you needed?
Yeah, and you're right. It was a pretty abrupt transition from office to ice cliff by design. And the way that came about was a decision really even a couple of years earlier when I started thinking about what I wanted to do when I retired at age 60, which felt early and was effectively an early retirement. And the more and more I thought, the more I concluded I wanted to go back and reconnect with things that had meant a ton to me growing up and that I had done with a lot of intensity and passion well into my 20s, even early 30s. And then I'd sort of gotten away from them. And a lot of those were super physical. It was cross-country ski racing and mountaineering in particular. So having decided that, it's perhaps less surprising that I kind of laid the groundwork. I spent a bunch of time in my last year of work getting myself back in shape. And then literally the day I officially retired and handed in my ID card and handed my key and left my office, I'd already sort of lined up a climb the next day. And that was both because the calendar worked and because I had a free day, but also a little bit if I was going to walk out of an office and away from a career that I'd been very much involved with for 33 years, I was just kind of itching to go reconnect with things. And there was just nothing that felt better than getting in the car and driving north and getting out some crampons and an ice axe and having at it. So it was an abrupt transition, but a little bit by design.
And another thing that fascinated me, Tom, is that you described being at a retirement seminar in Florence, surrounded by people that were planning their board seats and second careers and thinking something isn't clicking. When did the idea of a gap year first take hold, and what did the idea unlock for you?
The gap year idea was a long time in the making. I would say before it took hold, because I'd taken things that at the time weren't called gap years, but effectively were at various stages in my life. So I got out of high school and thought I was going to go straight to college and cross-country ski race, which was what I was sort of living to do. And then kind of in the middle of all of that, ended up going off to Sweden and spending a year in a little town on the Arctic Circle, where I also got to ski a bunch, by the way. And that was just a year off before I went to college. And 2020 hindsight ended up being an incredibly enriching year for me. And then I graduated from college and thought I was going to keep ski racing. And instead, long story, but I ended up stopping that and spending 3 years traveling all over the world, planning and leading what were called expedition trips and tours. And so that was sort of 3 years of crazy stuff all over the place, not called a gap year per se, but nonetheless. And so I had done those earlier in my life. And the reason that's relevant is I was sitting in that planning seminar you refer to in Italy, where my firm was getting these kind of very senior partners all together saying, you're going to be retiring in a few years, time to start planning. And everybody was sitting there planning the sort of usual things for people in that situation and same situation I was in. And most people at age 60 or their late 50s, it was about, what boards of directors might they go on, or what companies did they want to go work full-time at someplace else, or maybe they'd be business professors or go into investment roles. And that would be the natural thing to do. And that's where the not clicking thing that you alluded to, something I sat there and said, I can do that. And I like it. And I've been doing stuff like that for 33 years, basically ever since I stopped roaming the world and kind of went into business and had a business career and raised a family. And that's when it all sort of hit me that the times I had taken what's effectively time off, when I'd sort of, jogged left when the whole world was going right, those had been some of the most rewarding years of my life and just built me and grew me in ways I never could have anticipated and really valued. So it just hit me that it didn't hit me immediately. It took some weeks of reflecting, but I said, I feel like there's something else that ought to be there. And then it hit me, it's time off in a different way. It's take advantage of the fact I've got the freedom now to pretty much do what I want to, at least for a while. And then the term gap year comes in because that's a term that's used a lot more. And I said, well, doggone, if high school and college kids these days can take gap years, so can I. So that hit me. And then all of a sudden stuff snapped into place for me. I kind of thought I might eventually get back into various business things. And in fact, I have, but I was going to take some time out and do these other things, ice climbing, skiing, mountain climbing. So that's what it hit me, if that answers the question. It really was it took a little while, but it was a realization that I could, at age 60, replicate some experiences that I'd had in my 20s and 30s, both specific passions I had and interests I had, but also the experience of doing something different for a while.
Going back to your introduction to mountain climbing, it's a pretty wild story because I believe it was through your babysitter's family that you got involved with mountain climbing. And I want to know, like, as a kid staring at that West Ridge poster, did Everest feel like a real goal or more like a distant mythical idea for the future?
Yeah, no, a great question. And you're right. The short answer is initially mythical goal for the future. It came about because, as you describe, I had this poster on my bedroom wall. It's this iconic photograph. The title of it is Everest, the West Ridge. And to this day, it's out there. It's this stunning black and white image of the entire upper portions of Everest West Ridge. And you look at this photograph, and then your eye goes down. And at the very bottom, you see these two dots. And suddenly you realize those two dots are climbers. And it turns out those two dots, those two climbers, were the first two people ever to climb the West Ridge of Everest in 1963. And by the way, both with strong ties to the Pacific Northwest. One was a guy named Tom Hornbein and the other Willi Unsoeld. And Willi Unsoeld, that little dot who I stared at, ended up, of all things, in my hometown outside of Boston, and not surprisingly gravitated to the outdoor, climbing and equipment store, which my dad owned. And through all that, really, it was a little bit the reverse direction. Willi and my dad became friends. And then Willi's a guy who I alluded to earlier, who eventually, when I was about age 8, took me along with his sons out rock climbing and said, here, I'm going to teach you how to climb. And then Willi's daughter, who became a pretty famous mountaineer in her own right, she was named for the peak in India in the Himalayas, Nanda Devi. Her name was for short Devi. And Devi Unsoeld, Willi's daughter, was our babysitter. I think it came that way through Willi and my dad being friends. And she was a whole influence on us, as babysitters are. And there's a whole story about Willi naming her for the most beautiful mountain that he'd ever seen in his climbing career. And then the two of them, Willi and Devi, going off to climb it together. And tragically, she died on that mountain. There's all kinds of history, and I don't want to say romance at all, but emotion wrapped up in lore in the Unsoeld family. But yeah, so that was kind of amazing that both of those people touched my life growing up the way they did. And to answer your question about Everest, just picture whatever rock star or athlete a young person could idolize. And in my case, it was idolizing this mountaineer who was the first person to climb the West Ridge of Everest. And here he was, teaching me how to climb. And so I stared at that picture. And now, really, to answer your question, at the time, and for me, this was now the early 1970s and mid 1970s when I was young, Everest was a completely unapproachable dream for any sort of regular person. Only the elite of the elite in the mountaineering world got a shot at Everest. Even then, only a few did. So that's why I thought of it more as a dream than anything else. And it was only later in my life I ended up doing a lot of climbing and a lot of mountaineering all over the world. And then, for reasons that have become apparent, Everest opened up. The advent of the sort of commercial guiding infrastructure on Everest evolved in such a way that when I was in my 30s, it suddenly became possible, if you were just a regular climber type person, not one of the elite, you could go climb Everest. And I almost did when I was 33 years old. And then, for a good set of reasons, didn't really. A friend of mine said, you're just an absolute idiot. You got a wife and you've got, a 1-year-old child at home and another on the way. And how could you possibly go take 3 months and climb Mount Everest? So I backed out in my early 30s. But at that point, it was starting to feel like a reality. But then I put it away. It was like, well, that was then in my life. And, as I write about in the book, I got happily very busy with a business career and raising a family and being a husband. And then when this all came together, that I can do this gap year thing when I'm 60, that's when it came back in again. And I said, no, I could do it now if I wanted. And in fact, if I want to do it, I'd better do it soon because I'm 60 and I'm not getting any younger. So it went from unapproachable dream of youth to something that maybe I should do and almost did in my 30s, to put completely on the back shelf and forgotten about it, and then dust it off in my 60s and suddenly very much a reality.
I think another mountain, especially here in the States, that has a mythical lore to it is Denali. And you described having a really powerful moment on that mountain back in 1992. And I think, if I remember the quote right, you said it was the most intensely alive you've ever felt. And for me, hearing people that have summited Denali and hearing it described as a blue-collar climb and a blue-collar mountain, because you got to make it up there with your own gear, your own efforts. Why do you think it took nearly 30 years to come back to that version of yourself once you decided to retire?
Yeah, interesting, because it is sort of agree with your assessment of Denali, which is there's a lot to love in that mountain. Was in the 90s when I was on it, still is. And that experience that you described me describing really hit me powerfully at the time. So then you ask the question, well, if it was that intense and that powerful, why 30 years? And the answer really is logical other life priorities, came into play. And I didn't regret them at all. It, in no particular order, was a business career, which I wanted to commit to and to some extent needed to. I needed to have a job to raise a family, but also those were goals and interests of a different sort. And then very much being a husband and being a father. And my wife Jill and I had 3 children. They're now very much adults themselves, but that became my primary commitment in life and source of satisfaction in life and meaning in life in a very, very good way. But business career I had was a challenging one. So there were a lot of hours involved there and a lot of travel involved there. So by the time you put a lot of hours and travel into a challenging but rewarding business career and the rest of your time into trying to be a good husband and a father, there was time for some walks in the woods and some casual skiing with the kids and the family, but mountaineering just wasn't on. I couldn't have taken the time to go away. I'm not sure I would have wanted to. Back to the risk point, at some level, I felt very responsible for people. And, there was certain situations I wasn't going to put myself in. So it felt totally rational to be doing other things and focusing on things that were important. It's just that then life evolved again in kind of a neat way. And suddenly I was going to have some time freed up because I was going to take an early retirement. And by the way, my kids were all now adults and kind of on their own and didn't need me in the same way. And you could say I was more expendable to some extent. Nobody said that, but maybe I would say that. So all of a sudden it opened up the possibility again. And really it did. I'll never forget. I was on Mount Rainier right at age 58 with our youngest child, our son, and I was there because my kids were getting into climbing and asked me to come do it with them, and I hadn't done it in 30 years. I remember being on Rainier at age 58, having not been in the mountains in a big way since Denali, basically, and going, I can't believe I haven't been doing this for the last 25 years. And now I am again. And now I can again. It didn't feel wrong or unnatural that I got away from it, but it felt so good when I reconnected with it.
Yeah, and that's beautiful that there on Rainier, it planted the seed to go after it again. And I definitely want to touch base on your first attempt to summit Everest in 2021, because I think a lot of us have faced a situation where the summit is visible. It looks like it's in reach, but weather or for whatever reason, something throws a curveball at you and you have to walk away from reaching the summit. And for you, it was weather. Can you take us back to that moment? Because I think you were already above Camp 3 where you had to make that decision to walk away.
Yes, no, you're exactly right. And it was weather. We actually got up to Camp 4, and this was the third of our so-called rotations. So we'd been on the mountain almost 7 weeks at that point. We'd climbed from base camp up to Camp 2 and then all the way back down. And then on our second rotation, we'd climbed from base camp all the way up to Camp 3 and then all the way back down. And then we got ready and we had a weather window that we sensed was closing, but we thought we still could sneak in a summit. So now we were heading back up and we were basically rushing because a storm system was absolutely coming in from the south. Our forecasters thought that there was a day or two we could probably get a summit in before that storm system hit the mountain. Now, the good news about all that is we had the mountain pretty much to ourselves because a lot of other people concluded they didn't want to go for it. So we climbed, pretty much we're the only people above Camp 3, climbed the Lhotse face up to Camp 4 in the South Col at 26,000 feet. And everything was, other than is the weather going to hold, everything was going right. My body was feeling as strong as I could hope for, and the team was doing well. And I remember being in that tent at Camp 4, and we were planning to leave that night for the summit and going, I can't believe it's really happening. And it felt like it was happening. And then basically the storm system arrived earlier than we expected, and it started snowing, and it snowed, and it kept snowing, and it got windy, and it rapidly became apparent there's no way we could leave for the summit when we intended to. And we hung for a little while longer to see if, well, maybe it would change or this was just some early snow, because sometimes it does change up there. But no, it just got more and more intense, meaning the snowfall got more intense. So here we were at 26,000 feet, and then it rapidly shifted because it became first extremely clear that there's no way we could climb to the summit. And the next thing that became extremely clear was we had to get down because you can get pinned down up there and we only had so much oxygen. oxygen, and that's how people die at altitude, is run out of oxygen and, in a snowstorm where you can't move. So suddenly the whole focus shifted just very clearly and urgently to we've got to get packed up and we got to get ourselves down this mountain while we still can get down this mountain. So that's how the shift happened. And we did. We spent the next 3 days climbing back down most of Mount Everest in a snowstorm. It took till really quite a bit after I was home and reflected on it to realize I wasn't done, because as you alluded to, I was disappointed not to get to the top, but understood it. You spend enough time in the mountains, that you don't always get to the top and that the weather dictates a ton. And I felt like the decisions were the right decisions and they were clear. I felt good we got back down. And I kind of felt proud of myself for being mature enough to go, look, it's too bad we didn't summit, but everything else happened. And I got, to your point, 90% of what I wanted out of it. And that all felt great until all of a sudden I realized I wasn't that mature, maybe. Or more that dreams die hard, you could say, or more that there just was, the term that kept popping into my head was unfinished business. It was just, there's just something in there that I've been dreaming of this my whole life. And I could let it go, but that probably took a month after my return, when I finally got home from Everest the first time, to realize that, no, I really wanted to go give it another shot. And then, of course, it wasn't a decision until I got my wife's permission to give it another shot. So I had to work up the courage to raise that with her, which I did. And bless her, she understood and sort of said, okay, even though she didn't love the whole idea. So yeah, to answer your question, it took that amount of time and reflecting. And it wasn't a bad feeling. I felt really good about the 90%. And I guess I just felt that other 10%, whether you call it spiritual or you call it dream fulfillment or you just call it that extra something in life, that I wasn't sure I had to go do it, but I felt this inner voice telling me I got to go do it.
One thing that I really loved reading and learning about, this journey of yours has really been a family affair. You've already described about, making it up Mount Rainier and that kind of planting the seed and invigorating your desire to do mountain climbing. But then your daughter, Holly, had an interesting perspective that really influenced your decision to go back to Everest. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, Holly did. Actually, it was really, as I was debating the additional 10% or not, or should I go or shouldn't I go? And I was thinking about that. And Holly, who is a mountain lover and has grown into very much a climber and mountain lover of her own right, she asked me, and she's, if nothing else, she's direct. And she would say, Dad, are you going back to Everest? I said, well, Holly, I don't know. I don't think I'm necessarily going back. I think I've done that. And she looked at me right in the eye. And at the time, trying to remember how old Holly was at the time. Let's say she was in her mid-20s. And she looked me right in the eye and just said, Dad, of course you got to go back. You just got to go back. It was interesting to hear that from your 25-year-old daughter, who was clear in her mind. And I mean, she'd known me for a long while and she knows me pretty well. It's not like that's what swayed me. But when you're trying to make an important decision, people who you love and respect and who know you well, their voices matter. And that certainly caused me to, maybe open up the thinking a bit or take that line of thinking seriously.
And when it came to your second attempt, you just didn't go back the same route. I feel like you maybe even made it a little bit harder because you did an approach that was different from your first attempt. Can you share with us what was kind of like the thinking process behind expanding the journey and not just the summit?
Yeah, and it very much was an expanded journey. And the thinking process on that started with when I decided to go back. And there was this idea that I'd already done 90% of it, which I had, meaning if you say you're on the mountain for 60 days, well, 59 of them had been pretty much what I had gone the way I wanted to. I had no quibble with them. By the way, later I realized that this was naive thinking, but at the time what I felt like was, well, I'm just going to go back and repeat the same old thing so that I can get that one day to go differently. And that didn't feel bad to me, but I sort of felt like, well, can't I make it more unique or more of a new life experience at the same time that I'm going to go get that one day, which is the climb to the summit that I didn't get the previous year. So I started thinking about ways I could spice it up. And for a while there, I was thinking of climbing it from the north side. I was even thinking of bicycling from Lhasa all the way to the north side base camp and try to climb the mountain from there. And I was trying to work that out. And then that all got tangled up in Chinese regulations and COVID. And it became very clear the mountain wasn't going to be climbable from the Chinese side. So that's when, instead, I pivoted right back to Nepal. And I said, okay, well, now I really am coming back at it from the side. I've already done it. By the way, I spent a lot of time in Nepal and love it. So that wasn't all bad. But that led me to say, well, I heard years ago, and I'd been aware of the fact fact that you can approach Everest if you want to from fundamentally a different side. It's through a region called the Makalu-Barun region, which is far more remote and far less visited than the Khumbu region, which is what you trek through typically to get to Everest. And most people who do go into the Makalu-Barun region, and they're not many, they go in to climb Makalu, the fifth highest peak in the world. And there's a trek you do up to Makalu Base Camp, and then you turn around and you trek back out. But just not long after college, I encountered like the one person I'd never known of who had done something that's doable, which is you can, instead of turning around at Makalu, if you're prepared to climb, and it's technical climbing, over 3 20,000-foot passes over the course of what takes at least a week once you get to Makalu Base Camp. You can climb over these super high mountain passes and cross these glacier systems. And then after you cross the third pass and drop down, you're in the Khumbu region. And if you keep walking, you'll reconnect with the traditional route into Everest. And I said, man, that I've dreamt my whole life of just doing that as a trek. I never thought of putting it together in combination with climbing Everest, but I realized I was going back to climb Everest. And I've trekked that Everest Base Camp trek multiple times in my life and loved it, but why not something different? So then I started scheming, well, could I put an expedition together that would trek through the Makalu-Barun region, then climb over these 3 passes, and then drop me back down into the Khumbu, and then connect and go up to Everest Base Camp and meet the team I'd be climbing with. And it turned out that would work. Now I had to think about it because it was a lot longer and more demanding and physically demanding. And the last thing I wanted to do was show up at the base of Everest physically depleted already, or sick as you can get, or, having already lost 15 pounds from that craziness. So I had to do a bunch of thinking, but I decided to do it. And did do it. And that turned out to be alone the approach, one of the great adventures of my life. And it all worked out well. I didn't get sick. I showed up at base camp healthy. And I actually showed up at base camp acclimated because those high passes I'd been up close to 20,000 feet for a week coming over those passes. So it actually set me up really well for Everest the second time. But mostly it was just a really amazing experience and way to come at the mountain.
Yeah, and boy, did it set you up really well because you were able to finally summit Everest. And one thing that I found fascinating is I think when it comes to social media, a lot of the Everest summits, it's either, catching sunrise or it's on a sunny day, clouds are wisping through the Himalayas, but yours was under a full moon. And I think you reached the summit around 2:15 a.m. You're the second person, Tom, that's done an extraordinary event or had an extraordinary experience where they didn't have the emotional release at the end that they expected. The other person that comes to mind is Monet Isabeth, the first United States woman to reach the South Pole unsupported. She described doing the trek, and then once she reached the South Pole, it kind of just ended. And I wonder if that was a similar experience for you where, you reached the summit at 2:15 in the morning, you accomplished your goal, your dream, but you didn't have the emotional release. How do you interpret that moment now?
I do think about it a lot, and it's fun to hear the story about the arrival at the South Pole because I can sort of picture that, and that's a pretty powerful story and image. But for me, here's how I think about it. The first thing, and by the way, you're right, to back up, we decided to summit, and the we at the time was me, and it turned out 4 Sherpas. There's this whole story about how the other climbers on my climb that year ended up backing out at various stages in the expedition. But the Sherpas still wanted to go to the summit. So the team reformed itself around me and 4 Sherpas, which was just neat in its own right. And then we got up to the South Col. Well, this time there were people up there because the weather was good, and we knew they'd be, as people do, leaving for the summit maybe at around midnight, leaving Camp 4. And we just didn't want to get stuck behind people, and we didn't want to get stuck up high on those narrow ridges. So that's where, and it was really the lead Sherpa's idea. He said, no, we're gonna leave at 7 in the evening. We're gonna get ahead of everybody. I'll wait, give ourselves a 5-hour head start. We'll summit in the middle of the night. And to your point, those were all the pictures I'd always seen too growing up, was sunrise and, sunshine and the view. And I'm like, well, okay. But I was totally up for it because my biggest concern always on Everest front was, what if I get stuck behind a bunch of people? So then we headed up, and it was light snow when we started, but you mentioned moonlight. We broke through the cloud layer, and it was a full moon just by chance. I mean, literally, look on the calendar, it was full, astronomically a full moon, and it was clear. When you're on snow in moonlight, and I could see all the peaks and all the ridges. And it suddenly hit me that this was astoundingly beautiful. It was a kind of beauty that I never could have dreamt of having. So I got sort of the surprise bonus experience, if you will, that way. So that's all the kind of like a Hollywood movie, like it's all moonlight, it's all amazing. And, and I felt good on the climb, and we got to the summit relatively quickly. And here I was on the summit, and now I'm coming to the question you're asking. And the answer is, and I am one of those who typically feels release on mountains. I get emotional, and I've had tears rolling down my face from a combination of relief and exhaustion and everything else on many mountains around the world. And I did not, maybe like this other person you're talking about, I had none of that. But I think it might have been for slightly different reasons, because I was so mindful, many mountains, but Everest in particular, the summit is at best halfway. And I'd studied it and read about it over the years. And statistically, the majority of the deaths happen on the descent. A lot of the bad stuff happens on the descent. So you're just not done yet, particularly on that mountain, because you're up high, you're at 29,000 feet, and there's a lot of stuff between you and the lower camps. So I was so aware of that fact that I was glad I was there. I knew I was there. I was check, and I'm pleased with that. But all of my energy and attention, I remember I told myself there are 3 things you got to do on the summit. The first is you got to get your Garmin and reach out. I had a pre-programmed message telling my family I was on the summit. Well, it turns out the Garmin had frozen on the way up, so I couldn't send the preset. So, all right, well, good idea, not going to happen. Second thing is I got to have a photograph. So I remember to get your camera out and hand it to one of your climbing companions and ask them to take a picture. Check, that happened. And then the third was I drilled it into myself. Don't forget your oxygen. Don't forget your oxygen. Switch to a fresh bottle. Check, check, check. Look around, because I was glad I was there, and it was a pretty cool view in the moonlight. But then I was just fully intent on, I want to get down, I want to get across the South Summit, and I want to get below, but really that whole traverse between the Hillary Step and the South Summit. I just didn't want to bump into other people on it if I could avoid it. And that's what I was thinking about. So I think that's really the reason there was no release. And by the way, it stayed that way. And we ended up getting down pretty quickly. We climbed all the way down to Camp 2 in one big long push. I was exhausted by the time I got there, spent the night, and then back down through the ice fall to base camp the next day. And still, I'm just like thinking, get down safely, don't mess up. There's always that ice fall that you're always kind of a little worried about, and got to get through that. And the reason I say all that is I got through that, and that's when release happened. I'll never forget. I walked the last half hour. You sort of get out of the ice fall and take off your crampons, and it's maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes of kind of working through the moraine to get back to where your tents are. And I sat in a chair in the dining tent, and boom, all that release that typically I feel up on summits, that's when I felt it.
I love that perspective, because you're right, especially on a trek like Everest. The summit's only the halfway point. You got to make it down safely as well. And to have that perspective and understand, because I think a lot of us have seen, pictures of a summit push where it's a long line of people, and trying to avoid that in order to reach safety is huge. Kind of going back to base camp, when you did have that moment, did it feel like closure, or did it feel like maybe this is just the next step in a longer journey?
Yeah, no, great question. It 2 things happened with respect to closure. I would say initially it felt like closure, or darn close to it, because real closure for me, for whatever set of reasons, was eventually get out of base camp, get kind of back to Kathmandu, and sort of get out of the mountain. And by the way, shave, take a nice hot shower, and kind of re-enter. And that's the moment. Every time I've come off mountains in Nepal, and I've done that a bunch of times in various places in Nepal, it's almost like when I'm out of the mountains and back in the city, and that's when re-entry is really complete. And then I've had time to sort of reflect and think. And I did this time as well. So I got back to the hotel in Kathmandu, and that's just an extension of the feeling of base camp. But there's sitting in the chair feeling the release. That's almost closure. There's some days later getting back to Kathmandu, really feeling what I think is closure. And it was, except, and the except is only, and I write about this in the book as well, I then came home, and now I'd been at this thing I'd branded a gap year. And at this point, it had been about 2.5 years of climbing all over the world, of which Everest was just a piece of it. And I sort of thought I was done. I was like, okay, gap year over at 2.5 years. And now I'm going to go back and do all that stuff that I was thinking I was going to defer. And I sort of started that, meaning doing some stuff in business and doing some volunteer work and involved some nonprofits I care a lot about. And all of a sudden in there, this is why it wasn't full closure, but it was in a good sense. I had this realization that it was really almost 3 years, but 2.5, 3 years of what I branded a gap year have been 3 of the absolute best years of my life, most fulfilling, most rewarding. Like there's no rule that said I had to walk 100% away from that. So there was, whether you call it closure or not, I said, man, I want to tap into some of that. And that's caused me, a little to my surprise, I thought the whole thing was over, if you will. And no, I then said, the way I ended up thinking about it in my mind was I want to kind of keep part gap year still going. And that led me to go back to Nepal and climb a peak called Cholatse that's frankly more challenging technically than Everest, quite a bit more challenging. Beautiful mountain. Only took a month, but I decided I wanted to go do that. So all of a sudden I found myself training again and getting ready to go on an expedition and go climb another mountain. And the reason I say all that is, in a weird way, that mountain, Cholatse, became closure for me. It was not icing on the cake, but it was another post-Everest experience that really made the point to me that this whole journey I had been on, Everest was a centerpiece of it, but by no means all of it. And the journey I'd been on sort of emotionally and mentally and in a lot of ways was bigger than Everest and broader than Everest. And in some weird way, it was almost when I stood on the summit of Cholatse, which, by the way, I did in bright sunshine with nobody around me, with an extraordinary view out to Everest and Lhotse in all directions. And I almost felt more closure then, oddly enough, than I did previously.
After that summit, you really started to explore other avenues outside of mountaineering, and you're doing something that is just extraordinary that I didn't even know was a thing. I know about cross-country skiing, but you're competing in cross-country ski marathons, and not just competing, but you're also winning at a high level. What does ski racing give you that, climbing doesn't, or what's the differences in how you approach ski racing?
Yeah, there are a bunch of similarities between mountaineering and ski racing, and there, to your point, really are some differences. So that also, the way that figures in a bit to the journey is that cross-country ski racing became what I did super intensely in my teens and early 20s. And that was kind of my life. And it's actually what took me out of the mountains for a little while was that. And in there is a lot of endurance training and really learning how to get your body super, super, super fit, which is what's required in cross-country ski racing. And that's also, by the way, directly relevant to mountaineering because you got to get yourself super fit to climb big mountains, and a bunch of the training looks pretty similar. By the way, and the experiences have some similarities, of course. They're both outdoors. They're both done often in winter conditions. They're often involve, physical, what feels like misery at the time, but later feels great. And so there are a lot of kind of outdoor challenge, outdoor endurance in beautiful nature similarities. And then, of course, there's some differences. Just climbing a mountain's one thing and everything that goes into it, and skiing a ski marathon or a ski race is another. So when I designed this so-called gap year, my initial thought was I'm going to ski race a ton and I'm going to climb mountains a ton, and that's going to work perfectly because it's fundamentally the same training. That's going to let me get my body where it needs to get to physically. And the training supports each other, and then I can ski some races, and those I picked were ski marathons, to your point, primarily, and they're longer, and that was mimicked what I'd be doing in the mountains, and they're just kind of exciting in a bunch of ways. And then I did both during much of my gap year. The one nuance is that after my first time on Everest, when I decided to go back and decided I was going to spend the next year optimizing for the time being only on Everest, I wanted that just, if I'm going to go back, let me make it all it can be. I sort of dropped for a little while some of the ski marathons and just train for the mountains. But then with Everest kind of, whether you call it done or that part checked, I felt liberated to jump back into some more of these ski marathons. And again, I get a lot that's the same that I'm alluding to, the satisfaction of achieving something that's physically very demanding, the close interaction with the natural world and just beauty. But again, there are differences. One is that these mountain expeditions take weeks, if not months at times, and a ski marathon you can do in a matter of one day or a couple of days. It's also, there's an aspect to competition, which I like, and a race is a race, and that's fun at times. It's a different kind of experience, whereas mountaineering in a beautiful way isn't a race. So when I'm mountaineering, I like that for that experience where it's just you and the mountain, but it's not about time or it's not about optimizing for speed. So those are some of the differences between the two experiences. And there's a lot that overlaps in a good sort of way. And the more I ski and ski race, the better prepared I am for the mountains. And the more I'm out in the mountains, the more I'm sort of in pretty good place that I can hop on the skis and ski pretty fast.
And talking about that physicality, one thing that I was wondering is, especially for me, I have a office job where it's mostly sedentary And I think a lot of people, whether they're in corporate or in office work, it's hard to balance, being active 100% of the time because of work, family, other obligations. For you, how did you physically kind of rebuild yourself to take on these things like the ski marathons and summiting mountains?
Yeah, well, I had the luxury of time, right? So I've been in exactly your situation as well, which is, in many people's situation, which was in an office and in a daily life where I didn't have the time, which is fundamentally one of the reasons I didn't do it. So, and maybe the happy message for all in that situation, at least what I've come to realize, is it's still out there for you at some point. And that certainly was for me. And that was a bit of a pleasant surprise because I was mindful when I thought about reconnecting with ski racing and I thought about going off back into the mountains and some big mountains. I was mindful that I was 60 plus years old, and the body, it doesn't move as fast in its 60s as it does in its 30s and its 40s. But the pleasant surprise was what I did have was the luxury of time. And with the luxury of time, one can apply oneself, and really the body can get in surprisingly good shape. And the minute you stop caring about matching the pace, if you will, like the literal speed that you used to be in your teens and 20s and 30s, and you just get comfortable with the fact that you're going to move a bit more slowly, you can do some pretty amazing things. And so I took that really seriously. It's one thing I loved when I cross-country ski race seriously in my youth, the science of training and the physiology of training. And I studied that pretty carefully. I read a bunch of excellent books that are out there now on the topic. I consulted people who thought a lot about it. And I went on pretty much of a 2-year program, meaning I knew I was going to retire at age 60. And starting at about age 58, once I'd made the decision that I was going to do this gap year idea, but I wanted to be ready for it, I said, I got a couple years and I know enough to know that you can't rush these things. You got to build slowly and steadily. But I started really applying myself both to the ski training and the mountaineering training. And that became a source of joy in its own right. Just the physicality, to use your word, and the reconnecting with the ritual of training. And by the way, just how you feel. I just felt great physically and great emotionally. And, because at least for me, that's what hard physical exercise does. It's just that now I had the time to do it intensely on a daily basis, which I hadn't for a long while.
We've discussed how your kids have played a big role in, summiting some of these mountains that you've experienced during your gap years. And you mentioned her already, but your partner Jill also played a big role in these gap years. And I think for me, one of the most honest threads in your book is your relationship with Jill. You wrote that this balance of you let me be me, so I have to let you be you. How did you navigate the tension between gratitude and the weight of what you're asking from a partner?
There is a balancing act there, of course, I think that all couples go through in a variety of ways. And that phrase, by the way, was Jill's, and I'll just never forget it. And actually, that phrase she uttered when I told her that I wanted to go back to Everest again, but asked her if it was okay with her, because it had to be a joint decision. And it's such an ask of one's partner and of one's family when one goes off and does this stuff. And I'll just never forget it. I kind of waited for the right day and the right time and sort of raised it, and she sort of looked at me, and I knew, by the way, she, for understandable reasons, really didn't like that aspect of what I was up to, and it was tough enough on her the first time, but let alone here I was wanting to go back and do it all again. And she said, she looked at me, she said, look, she said, I knew you were going back. And then she said, let me be me, I got to let you be you. And I'll never forget those words and that sentiment, because it was a wonderful gift by her to me. Really, all of her understanding and patience with me through what was ultimately 3.5 years of this sort of stuff really was that. And it was, I think, her understanding how much these things meant to me. Some of it she could fully understand and appreciate, and some of it she scared her, and some of it just took me away for long periods of time. But I think she was committed in a very generous way toward letting me be me in that dimension, even though it came at a cost to her. There's been a life lesson in that for me. And I think we all, in relationships, there are various forms of balance that run through relationships, and we all respect the interests of our partners and people in relationships with, and kind of find that balance as works for couples in a variety of ways. And you're right, I do write about it in the book. This whole multiple years of sort of taking off to go off all over the world and do this stuff at a time when typically it would be, well, hubby retires and then we get to hang out together a whole lot and sort of figure out how we want to spend our days together. And that's exactly not what I was doing initially. So it kind of caused us to have a different sort of find our balance journey together, at least in those initial years. So I'm super grateful to her for giving me that, that freedom. And I feel kind of proud of us as a couple for having sorted that out together.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big takeaways and highlights of your book is just the understanding and support from your family members in helping you achieve what you achieved during these gap years. Tom, when I first got your book, and thank you for the early copy, like you said, when you hear gap years, it's normally describing a high schooler taking a gap year between college or college student before they hit the real world. Sometimes it's defined as a chapter in life. But by the end of your book, it feels like for you, it's a new way of living. Has the gap year just kind of become your life now, or is it still defined as a chapter in your life?
I thought a lot about that and sort of the concept of the gap year and sort of what is it now. And I think you're onto it and you've picked up on it. I didn't know it at the time because when I set out, I very much thought, okay, I'm turning 60 per plan. It's going to be a year and a half, but I'm going to call it a gap year. And then it became, all right, it's going to be 3.5 years, but I'm going to call it a gap year. But all along, I sort of thought I would be done with that and then back to whatever else you define as the normal flow I was going to follow. But I'm now at a place that I've come to realize the way I describe it to myself and others is I kind of want 50% work. And for me, work, that'll be defined as some corporate stuff I do and nonprofits I care a lot about and things like that. And then the other 50% is gap year. What I mean by that is the spirit of everything I felt in my gap year, still the ability to go on adventures and the feeling of growing in new ways and the feeling of immersing myself in these, we call it the passions of youth or things that meant a lot to me in the past and still can, and places that meant a lot to me in the past and still can. And then I had the realization I can do that. There are no rules here. So if I want to be half work, half gap year, I can be half work and half gap year. And then I realized, who am I kidding? A lot of people just say, well, you're calling it gap year. Really what that is retirement. And it probably is. I've probably kind of found my way toward, I'm now 66. What for me at age 66 feels like how I want to have whatever you call it, whether it's retirement or not. And that's half work and my terminology, half gap year. So I grew into that realization, but it's really, I don't know how long it's going to stay feeling that way, but that's kind of the zone I'm in right now. And it makes me appreciate the work half a ton. And I get a lot out of that work half. I don't think I'd be wanting to be gap yearing full time at this stage, but I don't want to be working full time either. So, and the ability to tap into some of what I found during my so-called gap years and still continue to live it is probably the biggest blessing of them all in a lot of ways.
A true blessing to be able to balance both of those and have both of those opportunities available. And I'd love to get your perspective, Tom, on this, because I feel like for listeners, especially those in an office environment who might be feeling stuck, or maybe they feel like it's too late to chase after a goal or a dream, what would you say to them to motivate them to chase that dream still?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking about that because this came so clear to me through my own experience. And it's a happy message. It is still out there for you. It just completely is. Whether the it is something that you have always wanted to do in your life and haven't yet done, or the it is something you did in your life and you loved and you thought you were done with, or any combination of those two. I mean, at the time, you sort of feel like, well, geez, I'm 30, I'm 40, I'm 50, I'm busy, I'm full-time. I don't have room for that, or I'm done with that, or I'm never going to get there. I probably felt that way, too, at those stages if I paused to think about it. And then I suddenly realized, heck, no, you can do it. It's still there. And I would argue more there for all of us than ever, given I think we all are healthier collectively or can be healthier collectively than previous generations did. And if you put your mind to it, it doesn't have to be physical, by the way. I mean, those interests and passions can be manifold. They could be music, or they could be art, or they could be lots of things. But long-winded way of saying what I came to realize is this notion it's still there, and you got a lot of time left. So it's been made the decade of the 60s so completely wonderful for me, is realizing there's a lot that can still be done. I fully intend for that to be the case in my 70s as well, if not longer. So that will be my message. It's there. You could sneak it in the middle of what you were doing, or you could just hold off and get to it when you get to it. And I kind of think the get to it and you get to it has some merit, because then suddenly you have the time, and the things that are keeping you busy right now are keeping you busy for a reason, but they're not going to be making those same demands on you forever, I don't think.
Kind of taking it back to the beginning of the podcast, Tom, when we talked about the West Ridge poster as a kid, seeing it and being inspired by it. After completing Everest, is there anything that you're looking towards in the future as a new goal?
Well, there are, and the fun is there are all these things I'd like to do, and I got to figure out which. It's fun. It's which of them do I want to do. I in fact just got back a week ago from Greenland. I skied, speaking of ski races, something called the Arctic Circle Race, which is a 3-day, 170-kilometer cross-country ski race through the middle of nowhere in Greenland. And it was, you spend 2 nights in tents, by the way, in a tented camp in between these long days of ski racing. And I had just never been to Greenland. I didn't even know about this race. And that ended up being, again, one of these amazing experiences. So now that's not out in the future because I just got back from it. But things that are on the list, and it's a long list and I won't be able to get to them all. The leading candidate right now is, assuming that it's open, there's a combination. It's a little bit like what I did going back to Everest the second time, which is sort of long trek through remote places plus climbing. And there's one in Tibet, fundamentally not too far from Everest, but on the Tibetan side. And I would like to recreate some routes that the British in the early 1920s followed when they were trying to find the way to climb Everest. And they didn't even know how to get to the base of the mountain. And they did all these amazing exploratory trips. And I've been reading the journals from those trips. And there's some routes that I'd like to go recreate. And then, oh, by the way, you can pass a bunch of quite large mountains and climb them. And that's probably the next goal of record for a year from now. If that side of the mountain doesn't open up, the Chinese have just shut it down again this year. I got some other things. There's something in Pakistan I want to do. There's something in southern Chile I want to do. So it'll be one of those.
I love the fact that the mountains are still pulling you, and definitely going to be rooting for you to do Tibet in 2027. And yeah, the fact that you're looking at retracing some of these early on treks from years past is incredible. And I can't wait to hopefully see you reach those destinations on those journals that you're reading. Tom, that was it for the regular questions. This next section of the podcast are questions that we like to ask all our guests, and I'm definitely curious on some of your responses. The first one is, when it comes to these expeditions or maybe even your ski races, do you have a pre-hike ritual or maybe a first mile mindset that you do on a regular basis?
I think my ritual, whether it's the first hour, it's really the laying out the gear and making sure the whole gear check, the gear packing, the gear organizing. And on a big expedition, of course, it's critical because you got to have everything. But I will lay it all out, as many climbers do, and item by item. And there it is on my living room floor, and just go through the checklist again and again. But it's almost mental, the check, and the picturing how every piece is going to be used. And of course, I've spent weeks in advance thinking about it. That ritual just sort of sets me up to go. If I've gone through that, well, then I can either start the trek to base camp, or I can show up at base camp and dive in the duffel and know it's there. And there's an equivalent in ski racing, which is, all right, the skis, are they waxed? How many pairs do I want to have waxed in different ways? Do I have a spare set of poles? What are the layers I'm going to be wearing? Thinking it through, laying it out. So yeah, for me, it's almost the pre-event checklist of gear, but it becomes more than just a checklist of gear. It becomes a little bit of a mental prep thing.
This one, same thing. I'm curious to know, is there a regular or go-to post-expedition meal or post-race meal or drink that you tend to gravitate towards?
I'm sort of embarrassed to admit this, but yes, there is. And I will say so if it's meal you're asking about and drink you're asking about, the drink almost never varies. And maybe I shouldn't be embarrassed. It's a martini. And typically I like my martinis, and I'm typically in the mountains. I'm not having to drop alcohol for weeks at a time. And there comes a point in every expedition when I start picturing the martini. It's usually about halfway through the expedition. So by the time I finally get back to civilization, it's sort of like there's the celebratory martini. I would not say that would hold true after every ski race I do, but certainly it does after weeks on a mountain. And then for the food part, grilled cheese sandwich, and probably with fries. probably, again, because I now feel entitled to it. I've lost all this weight, which you typically lose on an expedition, and you need to put the pounds back on. So I always feel fully entitled to usually multiple grilled cheeses and big plates of French fries.
Now, this next question, Tom, and you mentioned, your love of prepping your gear and getting ready for expeditions and races. What's the one piece of gear that you'll never compromise on now?
If I can only pick one, it's going to be boots, mountaineering boots, hiking boots. And if I can pick two, it's going to be gloves, mittens, gloves, particularly at altitude and particularly in extreme environments. The fingers go and the toes go. And the only reason they don't go is if you've got, you got to have the right gear. And mine have gotten over the years singed enough that they're sensitive. So more than ever, I've got to have like the best possible hand system I can have and the best possible, boot for the conditions.
And I got to ask, Don, just because I've recently converted from gloves to mittens, do you have a preference at all?
Yes, probably like everybody, and you sound like you've lived this too. If I can get away with gloves, of course I'd rather have them because you have so much more dexterity, and it's nothing worse than trying to fiddle with a carabiner for me when I can't get the thing open, or I can't clip into an anchor point, or I can't hold my ice axe, or whatever it is, or for that matter, on a cross-country ski race. Just gloves are way easier to manipulate things. But my fingers start to go, and gloves are just way warmer. So the other end of that spectrum that you're probably on now is the mitten, and increasingly that's where I go just because I have to go to assure that my fingers, I don't lose them. But the thing that I'm really loving for now, and if you may be there already, Ivan, if you're not, a strong recommendation, that's the so-called lobster, mitten, which is you get one finger. So most of the mountaineering systems have those. And then they're kind of a compromise between a little bit of the dexterity of the gloves, but warmth of the mittens.
And now on the flip side, Tom, what's the most overrated piece of outdoor gear that you've experienced?
Oh boy, that's a great one. This is going to sound trivial, but I still think it's my answer. For me, it's bowls, and really it's the bowl. It's the dining bowl. Like you can read up on, and you can be on an expedition. Everybody hauls out these massively engineered collapsible bowls or plates, or folding bowls and plates, or there's big wide plastic ones, or there's this ones, or there's that ones. We all think a lot about gear, so do I. But every time I ever go on an expedition, no matter how much I've thought about it, that becomes like so irrelevant. I'm either eating out of, a freeze-dried food bag with a long-handled spoon, which I do not believe is overrated, a long-handled spoon, or I've got one big mug that I'm eating everything out of. So every time I've invested a bunch of time and energy into some bowl, it turns out it doesn't matter for me. But that's a pretty small item in the realm of equipment.
And then, Tom, you already mentioned, Tibet in 2027, and you just came back from Greenland. Are there any other expeditions or outdoor goals that you have for 2026?
Nothing big. The Greenland was sort of it for the spring. And now I'm in my, a little bit get back from that, recover on a little bit. And this book is launching, which I'm super excited about, and supporting that and seeing that through. And so there'll be a bunch of travel to really fun places just to talk about the book and talk about some of the things that I experienced over the years. But those are not big adventures. Those are more they're just some nice places that will have good day hikes. So I think long-winded way of saying I'm going to be doing a lot of really fun day hiking in New England in the rest of 2026 and loving every bit of that, and then save the next sort of big event for 2027.
Well, that brings us to the last segment of our podcast, Tom. It's the this or that questions. I'm going to give you 2 hiking related topics, and you just choose which one you prefer out of the 2. You're more than welcome to say both or neither. But the first one is, if you had to choose between these 2, would you go dense forest or wide open views?
Oh, man. I think I got to go wide open views. It just does it for me all day. I like them both, but wide open views.
And then this next one might be tough, but peak bagging or wandering miles?
I sort of like the peak for the peak's own sake, as opposed to the kind of check, where the wandering miles connotes a little more of freedom and less structure.
And then this next one is about accommodations. Would you prefer a cabin stay or tent camping?
Tent camping all day, every day. I like cabins. I've had some great stays in cabins, but nothing better than a tent, in my opinion.
And then this one is one of our harder ones for this season, but if you had to choose, would you go with a bug bite or blisters?
Oh, man. I'm going to go blisters because I know how to fix them. I just get the moleskin and, whatever else, and I can deal with it. Whereas the bug bite, I have a harder time vanquishing.
And then this next one I'm curious about. On any of your expeditions, or even when you're ski racing, do you have a earbud in to listen to either music, podcast, an audiobook, or are you strictly nature nature sounds only?
I'm nature sounds only. For the first time ever, did a long ski with music just once this winter, just because it was going to be mind-numbing and I needed to get a long one in. And I could totally see why people do it. It makes total sense to me. It made the ski go much easier. But in general, no, I just preferred nature.
And then when it comes to your day hikes or even backpacking trips, when it comes to your footwear, are you using hiking boots or trail runners?
Both, and that varies situationally. So light day hike, I'm trail runner. Approaches, by the way, into a number of the mountains I climbed, Aconcagua down in Argentina, even into Everest, on the traditional route, the so-called approach shoes. Not quite a trail runner, but a little heavy version of it. But anytime I'm in anything, scree, snow, gravel, or if I've got a heavy pack on, then I'm in a boot.
And then the follow-up question is, does it matter for you if you have a Vibram outsole or just a regular outsole?
I think I used to think that Vibram made a big difference, and now I've maybe gotten off worrying about that, at least the brand of it. And I sort of trust the manufacturers, if that makes any sense.
This next one, I'm really curious about your response, but when it comes to these two type of summit conditions, would you go with a windy summit or a cloudy summit?
I think I'm going to go windy, just because I'm a big one for the views, and usually I can dress against the wind.
And then when it comes to accessing public lands, are you more of a national park connoisseur, or do you prefer hidden gems?
I like them both. I guess I was allowed to say I like them both, but I guess I'm probably, if I had to pick one, I'm hidden gem. And if I'm going to straddle both, I'm going to say I will go for the hidden gems in the national parks.
There we go. I like that. And then this one's possibly tough. I feel like I know the answer just because you're based out of the Northeast, but spring wildflowers or fall colors?
I'm actually going to surprise you. I'm going to say spring wildflowers, and part of that is because I'm red-green colorblind, so the fall foliage disappoints for me, meaning I don't see it all, whereas there's something about the spring flowers, I see them a little more intensely.
Oh, you and me both, Tom. And we just had a guest who is also red-green colorblind. He said that the colorblind glasses made a world of a difference when it came to the fall colors. So much that I think he's going to convince me to get them and give them a try for this upcoming fall season.
I did the same thing last fall, and I didn't change my life, but it certainly helped. I'm glad I got him, so I think he's onto something.
And then the last one, Tom, is when it comes to the different levels of fun when it comes to outdoor experiences. We have the type 1, type 2, type 3, but when you had to choose between type 1 or type 2 fun, which one are you going with?
I think I have to say type 2. I like them both, but Everest is all type 2. The Greenland race was a lot of type 2, and Denali was a ton of type 2. Name the mountains. The ski marathons are a lot of type 2, but they're the ones that really stick for me.
Awesome, Tom. And that was it for the this or that questions. Thank you so much, Tom, for coming on the podcast. For folks that want to grab a copy of The Gap Years, which as of the time of this episode release, is available at all major markets. Tom, where can folks find more information about the book, and where can they pick up a copy?
Well, thank you for asking. Yes, the book title again is The Gap Years, subtitle Climbing, Skiing, and the Journey Back. And it is available at all the usual places. So anywhere people like to buy their books, it's there. And if they're looking to learn more about the book, or for that matter, more about any number of the trips I've described, my author website has got maps and photo galleries and descriptions and all sorts of stuff. And that is TomFrenchAuthor.com.
Appreciate it, Tom. And we'll be sure to put those links in the episode show notes so people can not just grab a copy of The Gap Years, but also learn more about the previous expeditions that you described here on this podcast. Again, thank you so much. It was a real blast having you on the podcast and hearing about the experiences that you have done during these gap years. It has been a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, thanks, Ivan. It's been a blast for me as well. Really appreciate it.
And that brings us to the end of this episode alongside Tom. We extend a heartfelt thanks to him for joining us on the podcast. Be sure to check out his new book, The Gap Years, Climbing, Skiing, and the Journey Back, now available at local bookstores, Amazon, and major retailers. And for more, be sure to check out the episode show notes. This episode of Hikes and Mics was produced by Jordan Smith. Be sure to follow her adventures on Instagram at jordan.journeys. New episodes will drop every Monday throughout the spring hiking season, with the occasional Friday bonus episode along the way. To make sure you never miss a moment of these inspiring trail stories, hit that follow or subscribe button. Your support truly keeps this community moving forward, one episode at a time. Don't forget to connect with us on Instagram at Hikes and Mics. That's where you'll find behind-the-scenes episode visuals, my own spring hiking adventures, and plenty more to keep that fresh air stoke alive as the season heats up. As we wrap up today's journey, remember, the trails are waking up, the wildflowers are on their way, and there's never been a better time to get out there and explore. So tread those happy trails, soak in the sunshine, and keep chasing what's just around that next bend. Until next time, my fellow hikers, happy hiking. This episode's music was created by Ketsa. Follow along with him on Instagram at Ketsa Music. This episode is brought to you by Ursa Minor Outfitters. Folks, I'm absolutely in love with my loon mug. It's handmade, it's an absolute piece of art. Whether it's at the office or at the house, people keep asking to check it out. If you're not a loon fan, they also have other beautiful mugs for wildlife fans of moose, bears, and eagles. They specialize in products highlighting the outdoors and local pride through quality design by local artists. They've even started expanding into items beyond mugs, like apparel, dog accessories, and soon candles and more. They also try to partner and highlight other small businesses, and in some cases, forgo profits in lieu of charitable giving to help their community, such as the dog rescue. So check them out, ursaminooroutfitters.com, and enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. And for our four-legged hiking partners, they also have a portable silicone dog bowl and also a sweet over-the-collar dog bandana. Go check them out, ursaminooroutfitters.com, and don't forget to enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order.